we can get started on Jesus the Teacher, we really have to work on our fabric selection. There are a lot of fabrics in the quilt itself. The cross fabric has 3 fabrics. There's a highlight fabric, there's an inner shadow, an outer shadow, and an outer border. Choosing the fabrics for each of these sections might take a little time, but if you listen closely, I'll give you some tips and tricks to make sure that your quilts will look beautiful. You can see here I have it in 2 different colorways that I've done as just the quilt centerpiece for my Parables quilt. And I chose a 3rd colorway in batiks for my standalone quilt. I'll talk about the fabric choices that I made, and I'll talk about some things that went well and did not go well. So that way you maybe won't make the same mistakes in your quilt. On page 1 of the pattern, I go over the fabric requirements and I give you some tips to keep in mind as you're selecting your fabric. The first tip is that all 3 fabrics of the cross 1, cross 2, cross 3, should all be of the same color or the same hue. It would not be very wise to choose a different hue for this outer cross area, because then it would no longer look to be a shadow of the cross itself. So try to keep that all the same color if at all possible. The highlight fabric in your pattern is shown white. You can see it here, it's in a white, and you can see here it's in a kind of a cream or an ivory. In this quilt, I have my fabric for the highlight is a periwinkle. You have to make sure that the highlight fabric is distinctly different between the cross and the inner shadow. So it should do that. It should make sure that the cross always stands out from that first shadow. You want to make sure that your highlight fabric doesn't include any prints that will look like they blend in to the cross fabric or to the inner shadow fabric. The 3 fabrics of the inner shadow should be a light, a medium, and a dark. You can see here I have a light pink, a medium magenta, and a dark magenta. In this quilt, I have a light turquoise. I have a mottled, kind of a blotchy turquoise and taupe, and then a dark turquoise. And in this quilt, I have a light, a medium, and a dark green. All 3 of those fabrics should be the same color or hue, just a light, a medium, and a dark. So you can choose any color you like for your inner shadow. You just need to make sure that all 3 of those are the same color. The outer shadow fabric should be slightly lighter than your outer border. You can see here I have some grays that turn to blue, and then the blue turns into a brownish gray. Here I have a light purple and it moves towards a dark purple. And here I have a gray and a taupey gray that moves towards a black. So that inner shadow should be slightly lighter than the outer shadow and the outer border. The 3rd fabric of the outer shadow should be darker than the outer shadow too, and lighter than the border shadow. You can see I had that continuation here where my grays turn to a blue, which turned to the outer. So you have that color continuation there. And here I have the same with the purples. And here I have the same with the gray taupes that turn into a black. The darkest fabric on the quilt should be the outer border. That way it frames the whole unit. In the event that you decide to keep that as a separate wall hanging, it will frame it nicely. And if you incorporate it into your quilt, you'll be using those same fabrics somewhere else in your quilt at some point as well. Now, I recommend that you do not use stripe. It's very difficult to do the cutting. Many of these units are simply little tiny 1-inch squares that look like a bar. So if you have a stripe, directionals can be very difficult, and directional prints can be very difficult. So you might want to avoid those. You'll also want to avoid busy prints and large scale prints, because these units, oftentimes, these are only a 1/2 inch by 1 inch. And so there's really not room for a print. I'm going to give you some close-ups to show you how I made some of the decisions I made, and that way maybe it'll help you make some of your fabric decisions. It's important to remember that you're going to be dealing with small units, 1.5 inch strips. When I first chose fabrics for my cross, these were the 3 fabrics I chose. up close, this fabric appeared darker than this fabric because it had a darker print in it. So I thought it went cross 1, cross 2, and cross 3. But when I cut the 1.5 inch strips, all of a sudden it was clear that the darker cross hatching of the brown here changed the order of my fabrics. Cross 1, cross 2, and cross 3. So it's important to take small pieces of your fabric to know what's going to work in each area. If you're choosing to make your cross a white cross, consider your white on whites and the scale of the different designs. From the distance of this camera, you cannot see, but I have a very small scroll here, and it's set off by a wider circle and then a dot pattern. It makes it so that up close I can see and differentiate between those 3 sections of my cross. From a distance, I just have the white cross. When choosing any of your fabrics, you had to think in terms of what would an inch show. When I initially saw this line of fabric by Quilting Treasures, I loved this fabric and I thought these were the fabrics I would be using in my Parables quilt. Well, I'll be using them in my Parables quilt, but I'm not going to be able to use very much of these in the actual first block, Jesus the Teacher, because the color changes so much on this fabric that an inch square sometimes might look turquoise, sometimes might look tan. The deeper, richer fabric, same thing. An inch might look orange, an inch might look rust. I couldn't use this fabric, but I loved the fabric, so I used small bits and pieces of it in the background here. And up close, you can see that it has just a touch of turquoise, just a touch of brown, but overall, it reads relatively neutral and it doesn't take away from my cross or my shadow piece. In my batik quilt, I also struggled with finding fabrics that were solid enough of a batik that I could use them in the quilt itself. This is a great batik, but you can see that depending on where I might cut an 1.5 inch square unit, sometimes it might have the dark blue in it and sometimes it might not at all. So it's important to be very careful when picking those fabrics. And I had initially thought that this would be my fabric that would be in the batik, in the cross, in the crown itself, in the carpenter's wheel. But some pieces are orange and some pieces are red. So this was not going to work for me either. Speaking of the carpenter's wheel, it's really important to choose 2 fabrics that sit next to each other on a color wheel. They don't have to be yellow and orange as you see here or that you see on the pattern. Just find 2 colors that are next to each other in the color wheel so that they complement each other. They could be yellow and orange, they could be yellow and green, they could be green and blue, they could be blue and purple, they could be purple and red. Whatever 2 colors that you choose, you're going to need 1 dark and 1 medium of each color. Make sure that the dark and the medium that you're choosing contrast nicely with your cross itself. So you can see here I've got good contrast, and you can see here that I have good contrast. But look what happens with the contrast here. I chose kind of a gold and then kind of a tan, a light brown, and it melts into the brown of my cross, and it actually makes it a little muddy. Up close, I can see the carpenter's wheel, but from a distance, I lose these points right here, these 4 points in a row. So make sure you don't make that mistake. If you have any questions on whether or not they have enough contrast, take a few small snips, stand back and take a look. Or grab your phone and take a picture and see if you can see good contrast in the pieces that you've chosen. There's no right or wrong. You can make your cross any color you like, and you can make your borders and your shadows any color that you like. The important part is you want to make sure that the carpenter's wheel and the cross are the highlight of your quilt. If you have any questions along the way, give me a call, send me some pictures, post something on our Facebook page. I'd be happy to help out. Thank you and have a blessed day.